Right, welcome. We are coming to you live from our studios in Johannesburg. This is the Week in Review, the program where, of course, we take a look at some of the big stories to come out of the weekend. Of course, what has kept you talking? As always, I'm your host, Liesl Wilson. Let's take a look at your top stories for today. 289 more people have succumbed to the COVID-19 related complications in the country in the last reporting cycle. The Constitutional Court has reserved judgment on the IEC application for the postponement of the local government elections. Well, taking a look at our top story for today, a group of anti-vaccine demonstrators are staging a protest outside Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town. The protest started at around 11 a.m. this morning. Our reporter Corbin August is outside the hospital where the protest occurred.
Let's just start with today's demonstration and why you guys are here.
First of all, I'd like to say that I personally am not anti-vaccines in general. In fact, I believe that this is not a vaccine campaign because these aren't vaccines, because they don't meet the medical classifications to qualify as such. In other words, they do not reduce infection or prevent infection. They don't prevent hospitalization and serious sickness. As such, they're not actually vaccines. If you have a vaccine when you're a child and you basically inoculate it at birth, you don't have to have a booster. That's a proper vaccine. Vaccines are modern medical miracle, and that is why they're using this word vaccine, also because the vaccine companies don't have any liability. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm not a COVID denier, and I'm sure that many of the people here are also not COVID deniers, and we regret very much every death and every disability that arises from COVID-19. So the reason why we're here is because we believe that there's a lot of censorship going on and the correct information is not getting out to the public. So we're trying to create awareness around some of the truths and facts concerning COVID-19 and the so-called vaccine rollout. My information on the vaccine from the beginning, because I work in the medical industry, was that there has never been an effective coronavirus vaccine, ever. The highest efficacy they've ever had is 46%. The reason for that is mutation. That is why no vaccine can ever work for a coronavirus, and that is why in the beginning the AstraZeneca was turned down due to mutation. It's also the reason why we now have failing vaccines in Israel and boosters. And that brings me back again to like these childhood immunizations that we receive. When last did you go for a booster for your TB shot? You don't do it because it's actually a good vaccine, a vaccine that works, a proper vaccine. That is what a vaccine is supposed to do. When you have chickenpox or measles as a child, you don't have to go for a booster. That is your natural immunity, you know, and that is what works better. The lockdowns, they don't work. This country has basically been unable to lock down. What we've had is a political and an economic lockdown. Places like Khayelitsha cannot lock down. They're congested and they're not the answer. They're not going to help us get out of this mess. A vaccine is also not the answer because, as I've explained to you, it doesn't work, number one. Number two, if you inject a vaccine into a pandemic, you actually stimulate the production of more violent, virulent mutations, which you can see in the spikes in places like Israel and Iceland, which are vaccination champions and now have hospitals and ICUs full of seriously sick individuals.
Okay, then Catherine, when you talk about the truth and the facts, and you're saying that the vaccine that they have now shouldn't actually be considered a vaccine. Just for normal people on the street, where can they turn to find proof and maybe studies to suggest, to tell them that, okay, what you're saying is now this is perhaps an alternative way of thinking?
Right, that's a great question because I think, you know, as we discussed, there's a lot of censorship. Even people in their families don't want to talk about it. So I would suggest the Children's Health Defense website, which is an American website, and also we are creating our own website which will hopefully be live next week, which will be called The Red List, theredlist.co.za. So there we'll be able to give solid information. Not all our information will be backed up. It will be backed up by verifiable data, case-reviewed, peer-reviewed case studies, and it will be verified information, verifiable information. one isn't the term conspiracy theorist is just being used to basically almost muddy the waters and stop people from actually getting the true facts. And that's not fair. Sometimes it actually almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because maybe not all theories aren't untrue. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, and then in the Western Cape, at the moment, it seems that supply of vaccines is outstripping demand. So at the moment we have more supply, but there just aren't that many people who are coming for the vaccines. Can you what do you think could be the reason for this vaccine hesitancy?
I think the reason for the vaccine hesitancy is that people aren't stupid. And even though they're not getting the correct information from government, they have done their own research. And, people tend to, the people that are pro this, inverted commas, vaccine campaign try to dismiss people like myself as being uneducated and, uninformed, whereas in fact a lot of the people that are anti this so-called vaccine rollout have done a lot more research than the people on the other side, and that's because they're quite passionate about it and they've taken the trouble and made the effort to do so. So I think that there's an underestimation with regard to the vaccine hesitancy issue. I think there are also a lot of issues around Africans being used as guinea pigs for vaccine trials, which is actually ongoing. I believe there's a trial on children now in South Africa again. We were used as one of the 3 countries for vaccine trials. Africa's often been misused in this way, and I think people are rightfully very sensitive about that and aware of those issues, so therefore negatively disposed towards vaccines in general.
Well, of course, that was our reporter Corbin August bringing us the latest from Cape Town. Again, that protest was happening just outside Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town. Well, moving on with other news that made headlines, over 5,000 people were murdered and over 10,000 raped in South Africa in the last quarter. These figures reflect startling increases in violent crimes like murder, sexual violence and hijackings. These contact crimes increased by 60.6% compared to the same period of last year.
Police Minister Bekele has released the quarterly crime statistics, and the latest figures reflect crimes that occurred between the 1st of April and the end of June this year. Murder increased by 66.2%.
Between April 21 to end of June 2021, 5,000 people were killed in South Africa. This is 2,294 more people killed compared to the corresponding period in the previous financial year.
Another shocker, the steep increase in reported rape cases. Rape increased by 72.4%. The minister says over 10,000 people were raped in South Africa in the last quarter.
This is an increase of 4,000 cases, amounting to a 72.4% increase compared to the skewed period reporting period. This number drops drastically to 2.8% if comparison was made to the normal period prior to lockdown.
Trio crimes also increased. Aggravated robberies such as carjackings increased by 92.2% compared to the previous corresponding period. 1,340 more residential robberies were committed, 46 cash-in-transit heists were recorded, and 181 farm attacks occurred, resulting in 15 murders. All assault categories reported double-digit increases. Gale conceded that the latest stats are concerning, but says it's more realistic to compare them to the period before COVID-19 lockdown started in the country, like in 2019.
And with all these shocking increases in most crime categories across the board, the National Police Commissioner is adamant that the men and women in blue are not losing the battle against crime in South Africa.
We are not yet losing the battle. The battle is still in progress. The stats that has been released now are operational stats and not strategic stats.
The minister and his team say with these disappointing crime stats, police will have to work harder to ensure that they protect South Africans, as it's clear that the lockdown safety zone is over. Patricia Fasahi, SABC News in Pretoria.
Well, moving on to news further afield now, Zambia's President-elect Hakainde Hichilema says his administration will be categorized by fairness and service delivery. Delivering his election victory speech in Lusaka, Hichilema says his priorities will include rebuilding the economy, uniting the nation and creating space for media freedom. The UPND leader won the presidential elections with more than 2.8 million votes over incumbent President Edgar Lungu's 1.8 million votes. Hichilema also thanked his predecessor for graciously conceding and called for unity while promising change and a better life for all citizens. Well, for more on this, we are now joined by Menzi Ndlovu, Senior Political and Country Risk Analyst, ahead of the inauguration, which of course is set to take place later in the week. Menzi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We've seen Zambia and the history of its elections. Some of the trends indicating that they've had a long history of organizing peaceful elections. It's not also new for incumbents to lose there. Now, ahead of the inauguration this week, how did the opposition this time manage to pull off the victory?
So, good afternoon to you, Liesl, and good afternoon to your viewers. The opposition managed to pull off this victory based on three factors, all right? A ripe economic and political environment, a very savvy and sophisticated electoral campaign, and competence among Zambia's institutions. Now, economically, Zambia's troubles have taken a heavy toll on the population. Poor macroeconomic fundamentals started weighing on development markers and the day-to-day lived experience of Zambians, especially the youth. For instance, the basic price of goods and services have skyrocketed, unemployment has skyrocketed, and service delivery has been poor. And this was placed at the feet of former President Edgar Lungu and his Patriotic Front, who managed to bring a thriving Zambian economy to its knees in 10 years of power. Now, the UPND and Hakainde Hichilema saw this and they capitalized on it. Now, from a political front, people had grown tired of what you might call the authoritarian creep that was happening under Lungu and the PF. So throughout the last 5 years, and as you have mentioned, Lungu and the PF have suppressed various freedoms. In fact, there was talk of the Zanufication of Zambia in light of the fact that Zambia was tending towards the path of Zimbabwe. But fortunately, the electorate was having none of that, and they voted against this trajectory at the ballot box on the 12th of August. And then there's something to be said about the campaign of the UPND, which was by all means exceptional. In fact, it can be compared to the campaign ran by Obama in 2008. They had a very clear, forward-looking message that was sensitive to the grievances and the mood of the time. They made brilliant use of door-to-door campaigning, and their social media game was, so as to speak, on point or on. This, of course, is in contrast to Lungu and the ruling party, which was relatively complacent. They pretty much hedged their re-election on their incumbency, which was not sufficient. So all these factors combined conspired to create a very opportune moment for Hichilema and the UPND, and they exploited it.
Absolutely, Menzi. You've touched on quite a few points, also using some of the more colloquial terms associated with the youth, which was a big component in securing this victory. I think to go back to one of the more pertinent issues you mentioned, I mean, what ultimately enabled the smooth transition of power was not just the goodwill of former President Lungu, but also, as you mentioned, the independent institutions, which was able to withstand. What does this then mean for Zambia's political landscape at large? In the same breath, what are the main challenges that now await the new Zambian president?
Very good question. So I think it reflects a few things about Zambia's institutions, as you've mentioned. First, I think despite lots of doubt heading into the election, it affirms the strength of Zambia's institutions and their ability to safeguard democracy and to withstand pressure. There was a lot of talk heading into this election that the ZEC, Zambia's Electoral Commission, and the judiciary would crumble under the pressure of the PF and succumb to the pressure of maintaining the status quo. This was not the case. they held firm. Second, it affirms the degree of democratic consolidation in Zambia. Now, as you've mentioned, the country has successfully and peacefully changed hands on 2 occasions, once in 1990 and again in 2007. But this time around, there was a lot of talk that the PF and Edgar Lungu were willing to win at all costs, including undertaking acts of malfeasance in order to achieve victory. This was not the case. And I think this points to the maturity of democracy in Zambia, which is often overlooked for reasonable considerations. Now, going forward, I think the challenge is to ensure that this strength is upheld. Institutions are further strengthened and further protected from political pressures. I think there's also a case to ensure greater youth participation. Although we've seen a tremendous amount this past election, I think registry was relatively low, and that could be improved. And to also improve the strength of other institutions that are responsible for upholding democracy in Zambia. Now, what is promising is the fact that Hakainde Hichilema and the UPND have recognized this. And I think we can expect greater political freedoms, greater media freedoms, and greater social freedoms, which should contribute to a much more vibrant democracy in Zambia, and also complement some of the economic reform that Hichilema has promised, and which is imperative to Zambia's future prospects.
Absolutely, Menzi. I think just before we get to what the implications of this election during a COVID-19 pandemic, unprecedented times, means for the rest of the continent, I want to hone in on the issue of the youth. I mean, it's very clear the youth are not clueless about politics, and the relationship between youth politics and elections was very evident this time round. I mean, we saw 54% of the 7 million registered voters were under the age of 35, 100%. Reflective of the stats relative to the African continent. I mean, now with the youth responding to this, to the increasing socio-economic hardships at large, how important is the youth vote for Africa going forward?
Yeah, I think you're touching on a very important point, Liesl. So historically in Africa, there's always been this notion that the youth is apathetic. We are more concerned with more immediate matters, partying, indulgences, our careers perhaps, than politics. I think what the election in Zambia and several other elections across the continent, for instance, Malawi and Sierra Leone, have reflected, and also to some extent other elections where the opposition hasn't won, like Uganda and like Zimbabwe a couple of years ago, is that this notion of youth apathy is no longer credible. All right, the youth is finally taking a stand. The youth is finally carrying the flag as the bearers or the flag bearers of democracy and the determinants of countries' political futures. And this is important, given the fact that the current politics and future politics are going to fundamentally impact the youth. So what Zambia and few other elections have shown is that the youth will no longer stand back and watch their future be jeopardized by regimes that do little to improve their immediate and long-term prospects. They are primed and they are willing to undertake or participate in politics. They are willing to hold regimes accountable, and regimes need to take this into considerations. No longer will the youth stand there and watch, they will participate. And if regimes do not tend to the issues and the concerns of the youth, they will be held accountable at the ballot box.
Well, Menzi, let's conclude this conversation by taking a look at the overall African political landscape at large. I mean, what is reflected through these elections? I think also broadening the discussion for those countries who are set to hold elections very soon, including South Africa.
Yeah, I think the point, again, is about the youth. We need to start taking the youth seriously, especially given the fact that they are comprising, or they're increasingly comprising, the majority of electoral constituencies. All right. So Parties can no longer rest on their laurels. They can no longer appeal to elderly generations and use narratives about history, which resonated with our predecessors for good reasons. All right. Parties are going to be required, and they are required, to tailor more forward-looking messages that responds to the youth's concerns. You can't come now about romantic notions about certain leaders. We want solutions. The youth wants solutions. It wants concrete solutions. It wants workable solutions. And I think the outcome in Zambia is a lesson to both ruling parties and opposition parties. For ruling parties to respond to the concerns of the youths, to also tailor their campaigns to suit the tendencies of the youth, to no longer rely on traditional methods of campaigning and traditional narratives. Those are outdated. Parties are going to have to get onto social medias. They're gonna have to stop this whole thing of reflecting on the past, which is what a lot of ruling parties have done on the continents. A lot of ruling parties, national liberation movements and others of them have tended to base their campaigns on backward-looking considerations. We have done this, we have done the other, so you should vote for us. No, it's about what can you do for us now? And of course, for the opposition, it's a lesson on how to challenge incumbents, on how to campaign in the face of various political challenges, on how to resonate with the youth, and on how to move or sway the forces of democracy towards your favor. So I think it sets a very exciting precedent for politics in Africa. I think it could stimulate greater competition, which is what we need in order to hold regimes accountable and in order to ensure more effective regimes that do deliver on electoral promises, that also ensure on better future prospects for the youth and the country at large and for the continent at large.
Absolutely. Menzi Ndlovu, once again, thank you very much for joining us again for that analysis. A Zambian election ended with the victory of the opponent, Hakainde Hichilema, who will be inaugurated this coming week. Menzi Ndlovu is a senior political and country risk analyst. Well, we'll be right back after this. Stay tuned with more updates. All right, welcome back. This is the Week in Review with myself, Liesl Wilson. We continue with more top stories for this week in politics. The Constitutional Court, in fact, has reserved judgment in the IEC's application for the postponement of the local government elections. The IEC, a number of political parties and civil society organizations made presentations to the Apex Court yesterday.
An election by the 1st of November is physically possible, but it won't be a free and fair election. So when we say impossibility in this context, what we mean, not that it's physically impossible, but what we mean is that it is impossible to meet all three constitutional demands.
These are some of the arguments that the Electoral Commission made before the highest court in the land. The Commission also asked the court, as part of its alternative relief, to assume supervisory jurisdiction, requiring the Commission to report to the courts periodically on its progress in arranging the local elections in 6 months' time. Political parties who supported the IEC in its application argued that holding the elections in October would have a detrimental effect on their candidate nomination processes. Some said they did not have the resources to run their virtual election campaigns.
The ANC needs to select in excess of 10,000 candidates from 257 municipalities and nearly 4,500 wards. The selection process is arduous and it's crucial to protect, and this is a very important point that the ANC makes in its evidence, it's crucial to protect the integrity of that process, as nominations can be heavily contested and it's necessary to prevent conflict.
And the difficulty that is faced by society, should it be that this nomination process is not undertaken, is the potential litigation that follows. Perhaps we should invite this court to consider the potential damage to not having this process.
The hope is that we will reach approximately 40 million South Africans. That's an increase of 30 million people. And what's important, whether that is 30 million who are vaccinated by February next year, or 20 million, is every single one of these people is an eligible voter. It's 18 years and above. That's who's eligible for the vaccine. So by postponing the election, we allow millions more to be protected.
Whilst political parties like the Democratic Alliance and the African Transformation Movement that are on the offensive say the Commission is seeking to covertly have the Constitutional Court amend the Constitution.
Whatever the court does, it should not postpone the elections and it should dismiss the application, because we say there's an easy option open to it, again, on the facts. That's hold the Commission to its promise. It's repeatedly made that promise before Justice Moseneke. It's made it now in this case. It's made it in reply, and it's made it through both of its counsel, Mr. Trengrove and Mr. Budlander, who repeatedly have told you that October is possible. They've made all the positions and steps. They've taken everything that they needed to do to make that election possible. They're just worried about whether it will be safe and whether it will be free and fair.
Let me say, both my clients submit that the relief sought by the IEC should be dismissed. And we do ask for costs, as an intervening party would. We'd be entitled to, along the lines of the Mashlope case.
Meanwhile, NGOs and lobby groups such as Freedom Under Law, the South African Institute of Race Relations, AfriForum and CASEC, who oppose the application, have argued that the IEC's application is inconsistent with Section 1592 of the Constitution. CASEC says granting the relief sought by the Commission would result in the Constitutional Court effectively doing the Chapter 9 institution's job for it. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, as we continue with our COVID-19 coverage, let's take a look at the latest numbers coming through. Another 289 COVID-19 related fatalities have been confirmed in the last reporting cycle. It brings the total number of fatalities to nearly 79,000. According to the National Institute for Communicable Diseases' latest report, 14,312 new coronavirus cases have been recorded in the last 24 hours in the country, with the positivity rate now standing at 21.6%. And that's where we're going to leave it for you today. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. Do catch us tomorrow for a look at the week ahead. From myself, Liesl Wilson, and the rest of the team, until next time, it's goodbye for now.